For nearly 3 decades, it sat in silence, untouched, unseen, and forbidden. A sealed vault hidden deep within palace walls, protected by royal decree and bound by Diana's final, unbreakable command. No king, no heir, no official had ever opened it. Until now. And when Prince William stepped inside, expecting closure, he instead uncovered something that would redefine loyalty, inheritance, and the future of the crown forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made that vault so powerful wasn't just what it contained, but what it represented. It was Diana's final act of independence, a silent defiance preserved in steel and secrecy, untouched even as the monarchy around it evolved, fractured, and rebuilt itself in her absence. Palace insiders had long whispered about it, but never openly. Its existence was acknowledged only in quiet conversations between the most senior officials, spoken of in cautious tones, as if even mentioning it too loudly might awaken something the institution wasn't ready to face. Diana had created it during the final months of her life, at a time when she was no longer willing to trust the system that had once promised to protect her. She didn't just place belongings inside. It was sealed under an irreversible legal order that no monarch could override, no matter their authority or position. Queen Elizabeth II herself had respected the seal, despite possessing the unquestioned power to demand access. She never did, and later, King Charles followed the same path, choosing silence over confrontation, perhaps understanding that whatever Diana had locked away was not meant to serve the crown as it existed then, but the crown as it would exist in the future. The vault became more than a container, it became a symbol, a final statement from a woman who had once stood at the center of the monarchy, then walked away emotionally wounded, but intellectually resolute. William grew up knowing it was there. He had asked about it as a young man, his curiosity driven not by greed or suspicion, but by a son's longing to understand the parts of his mother that had been hidden from him. Each time, the answer was the same. It wasn't time. He wasn't ready. The vault wasn't ready. And so he waited, carrying its mystery quietly, never knowing that its existence was not simply a memorial, but a carefully designed moment waiting to unfold. In the hours before its opening, palace corridors filled with a tension that could not be publicly explained. Staff who rarely showed emotion moved with careful urgency. Conversations stopped abruptly when certain names were mentioned. No one knew exactly what Diana had left behind, but everyone understood that whatever it was, it had the power to change things, not gradually, not symbolically, completely. William himself entered the moment with restraint, believing he was finally confronting something personal, something emotional, something meant to help him reconnect with a mother he had lost too soon. He expected memories, letters, pieces of a life interrupted. He expected grief. What he did not expect was that Diana had not left him answers about the past, but instructions for the future, and the weight of that realization began pressing down on him long before he ever reached the center of that silent, waiting space, because even before the vault was opened, Diana's voice was already reaching across time, guiding events with an authority no one could deny, and forcing the monarchy to confront a truth it had spent decades avoiding. Because the decision to open Diana's vault wasn't sudden, it was triggered by a quiet legal clause she had buried years ago. 1. Designed to activate only when the future of the crown stood at a dangerous crossroads. Diana knew something the rest of the world didn't. She knew her voice might not survive within palace walls, but her intentions would. Hidden inside legal documents filed months before her death was a clause so powerful, it could override royal hesitation itself. It was never meant to be triggered casually. It was designed for a moment of crisis. And when that moment arrived, the palace had no choice but to obey her final command. What makes this clause so chilling is not just its authority, but the quiet precision with which Diana built it, as if she understood that her greatest influence would not come from what she said publicly, but from what she left behind in silence. She had moved carefully, deliberately, seeking out legal minds who operated beyond the reach of palace influence, people who answered to law, not tradition. She didn't trust the system anymore, not completely, and she had learned through painful experience that power within the monarchy was not always exercised openly. Sometimes it was hidden, sometimes it was delayed, sometimes it waited, and Diana decided she would do the same. The clause itself was not simply a command to open the vault. It was a test. It was written to activate only when William had crossed a threshold that was never defined by age alone, but by emotional readiness and institutional pressure. Diana didn't want the vault opened while he was still vulnerable, still uncertain, still finding his place within the machinery that had once overwhelmed her. She wanted him strong. She wanted him aware. She wanted him standing at the exact moment when understanding her truth would not weaken him, but fortify him. And so she removed the power of interference entirely. No reigning monarch, not even the sovereign, could override it. No royal advisor could dare delay it indefinitely. The clause recognized only one authority, William's presence. Without him, the vault would remain closed forever. Palace officials had quietly hoped time would bury it. They believed that as decades passed, its relevance would fade, that its legal force might weaken under the weight of evolving royal structures. But Diana had anticipated that too. She had constructed it with a permanence that could not be undone. When the trigger finally activated, there was resistance not openly, not publicly, but in subtle delays, procedural hesitations, quiet attempts to control the timing. Yet none of it worked. The clause was absolute. Its activation signaled something far greater than a legal obligation. It signaled that Diana had decided this was the moment William needed the truth, not for himself alone, but for what he would soon represent. Because Diana had never seen the vault as a simple inheritance. It was a safeguard, a shield, a final intervention from a mother who understood that the greatest threats to the crown did not always come from outside, but from within its own expectations, its own silence, its own refusal to confront emotional reality. Those closest to her had sensed this shift in her long before her death. They saw the distance growing between Diana and certain figures within the institution. They saw her resolve harden, her clarity sharpen. She wasn't acting out of bitterness. She was acting out of certainty. She knew the future would place enormous weight on William's shoulders, and she wanted him prepared not just with duty, but with truth. She understood that the monarchy would demand strength from him, but she also knew that strength without emotional clarity could become isolation. And so she left behind something that could never be ignored, never be silenced, never be written by anyone else's agenda. Because even Diana's closes, allies never fully understood the true purpose of the vault, because its contents were not meant to protect the past, they were meant to choose the future. Witnesses would later say William froze, not out of fear but disbelief. Inside the vault were items he never expected to see. Objects, letters, and official documents arranged with chilling precision. This wasn't just a memorial, it was a message. And at the center of it all was something that forced William to question everything he thought he knew about his mother's final intentions and her vision for the monarchy he would one day lead. For most of his life, William had carried a quiet assumption about this moment. He believed that when the vault was finally opened, it would offer comfort, something personal, something human, a reminder of Diana not as a symbol, but as his mother. He expected fragments of her private world, handwritten notes, sentimental objects, perhaps pieces of her life she had kept hidden from public view. He thought it would be emotional. He thought it would be painful, but he never imagined it would feel strategic. Because what he encountered inside was not chaos, not grief preserved in disorder, but intention preserved in perfect clarity. Every document had been placed with care, not as a collection of memories, but as a carefully constructed narrative. Diana had not left behind confusion, she had left behind direction. The realization settled heavily on him. This was not simply a vault. It was a decision waiting for its moment. There were legal directives, each one unmistakably deliberate. Inheritance assignments that did not follow predictable paths. Authority transfers written in language that carried both personal and institutional weight. Diana had documented her intentions with extraordinary discipline, as if she knew that someday every word would be examined, not just by her son, but by the institution itself. And beneath those formal declarations were letters. Letters addressed only to William. Letters no one else had ever read. Letters that spoke not to the future king but to the son she had left behind. Her words carried truths she had never spoken aloud, truths she had protected him from while she was alive. She wrote about trust, about isolation, about the emotional cost of wearing a crown the world admired but few truly understood. She didn't speak in bitterness, she spoke in warning, and in hope. She wanted him to see clearly what she had seen too late. William read slowly, absorbing not just the meaning, but the weight behind every sentence. Each page felt less like a message and more like a hand reaching toward him across time, guiding him towards something he could not yet fully understand. What unsettled him most was not just what Diana had written, but how precisely she had planned this moment. Some of the legal documents had never been processed through palace channels. They existed outside the system entirely, immune from revision or interference. She had anticipated resistance. She had anticipated doubt. And she had ensured that when the truth finally emerged, it would emerge intact. William paused, not because he wanted to stop, but because he needed to understand what this meant. This was no longer about loss, it was about purpose. He could feel it building, the sense that Diana had not simply left behind memories, but instructions. Around him, even those who had spent their lives serving the monarchy sensed that something irreversible was unfolding. No one spoke, no one interrupted, because they understood, instinctively, that this moment did not belong to the palace. It belonged to Diana and to William, and as his eyes moved across the final pages, he began to realize that the truth waiting at the center of the vault was not due, saint emotional, it was transformational. Because it wasn't the emotional letters that shook William most, it was one specific legal declaration, written in Diana's unmistakable hand, that would send shockwaves through the entire royal institution. There it was, unmistakable, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. A signed declaration naming Catherine, not William, as the sole heir to Diana's personal legacy. Not shared, not divided, sole heir. It wasn't just unexpected, it was unprecedented. Diana had chosen Catherine, a woman she never lived to meet, as the true guardian of her legacy. And in that moment, William realized his mother had seen something long before anyone else did. The words did not leave room for interpretation. They were direct, precise, final. Diana's declaration did not follow tradition, nor did it attempt to soften its meaning. It transferred full control of her private estate, her personal letters, her symbolic possessions, her emotional inheritance exclusively to Catherine, not as a gesture of affection, but as an act of trust. It was not written as a possibility. It was written as certainty, and that certainty carried a weight that no one inside the palace could ignore. William stared at the page, not because he didn't understand it, but because he understood it too clearly. Diana had not overlooked him. She had not forgotten him. His name was there, carefully acknowledged, his role honored, but she had drawn a distinction between inheritance and guardianship. She had chosen Catherine not to replace him, but to protect something he alone could not carry. And in doing so, she had quietly redefined the balance of emotional authority within the monarchy itself. Diana's words described Catherine as the future protector of the crown's emotional integrity, a phrase that echoed with meaning far beyond legal language. Emotional integrity. Diana understood how easily it could be lost. She had lived through the consequences of its absence. She had endured isolation behind public perfection, and she had come to believe that the survival of the crown depended not only on strength, but on empathy, on humanity, on someone who could stand beside the future king and protect the part of him the institution could not protect on its own. What made the declaration even more extraordinary was its timing. Diana had written it years before Catherine had entered William's life, years before anyone could have predicted the woman Catherine would become, and yet Diana had spoken of her with quiet certainty, as if she trusted something beyond circumstance, something beyond proximity. It was not a decision based on familiarity, it was a decision based on belief. That belief unsettled the foundation of palace expectations. Officials who had spent decades preserving hierarchy immediately understood the magnitude of what had been done. This was not simply an inheritance transfer, it was a symbolic elevation. It placed Catherine in a position no royal spouse had ever occupied, not just as William's partner, but as the chosen guardian of Diana's emotional legacy. It bypassed tradition without apology. It rewrote assumptions without permission, and it forced the monarchy to confront a truth it had never prepared for. That Diana's final act had not been about preserving the past, but about shaping the future. William could feel the implications unfolding around him, not just politically, but personally. His mother had entrusted Catherine with something sacred, something fragile, something invisible, yet powerful enough to influence everything that came next. And as the meaning of that decision settled into his understanding, he realized that this was not a rejection of him. It was a protection of him. Diana had not chosen Catherine instead of William. She had chosen Catherine for William. Because Diana hadn't just named Catherine heir, she had also left behind a personal explanation, one that would leave William emotionally shaken to his core. Folded carefully beneath the declaration was a letter addressed not to William, not to Charles, but to Catherine, written years before Catherine ever imagined becoming Princess of Wales. Diana's words weren't political, they were personal, and they revealed something extraordinary. Diana hadn't just chosen Catherine as heir, she had chosen her as the one person she believed could protect William from the very system that once broke her. That truth alone carried a gravity that was almost unbearable to comprehend. This was not inheritance in its traditional form, this was foresight. This was intention. Diana had written to a woman she had never met, yet somehow understood with remarkable clarity, as if she had recognized Catherine's presence in William's future long before the world ever would. Her words did not speak as a princess, nor as a public figure. They spoke as a mother whose greatest fear was not losing her own voice, but losing her son to the same silent pressures that had once reshaped her life from the inside. She expressed faith in Catherine's emotional strength, not in vague terms, but with deliberate conviction. She described her as someone capable of standing firm when everything around her demanded compromise, someone who could endure scrutiny without losing compassion, someone who could see William not as the future king, but as the man beneath the title. Diana knew how easily that humanity could be buried beneath expectation. She had lived that transformation herself. She had felt the distance grow between who she was and who she was required to appear to be. And she feared the same fate for her son. In Catherine, she saw resistance to that erasure. She saw stability where she herself had once faced isolation. The letter did not pretend that Catherine's path would be easy. Diana acknowledged the emotional burden she was placing upon her. She warned her that loving William meant loving him through pressures no ordinary relationship could survive. She warned her that the crown would test her resilience, question her loyalty, and attempt to define her before she could define herself. But alongside that warning was something else, a blessing. A quiet affirmation that Catherine possessed something rare, something unteachable, the ability to protect not the throne, but the person destined to sit upon it. Diana did not frame Catherine as merely William's partner. She framed her as his safeguard, his emotional anchor, his shield against the invisible forces that had once left Diana feeling alone, even when surrounded by ceremony. And in doing so, Diana entrusted Catherine with something far more fragile than inheritance. She entrusted her with William's emotional survival. William read those words slowly, absorbing not only their meaning, but their intention. He realized that Diana had never doubted him. She had simply understood that no one could endure the crown alone. She had not chosen Catherine out of preference. She had chosen her out of necessity, because she believed Catherine would preserve the part of William that the monarchy itself could never protect. That realization reshaped everything. It reframed Catherine's role not just within the family, but within Diana's unfinished story. She was no longer simply William's wife. She was the continuation of Diana's final act of protection. And William, standing at the intersection of past and future, could feel the emotional weight of that decision settling into place, because the emotional impact of Diana's letter was only the beginning, because news of Catherine's designation triggered immediate reactions behind palace doors. Inside palace corridors, panic spread quickly but silently. Senior officials understood what this meant. Diana's declaration didn't just honor Catherine, it shifted symbolic power. And with it came fear, because Diana's voice, long silenced, had suddenly returned with undeniable authority. And not everyone was ready to accept the woman she had chosen as the crown's emotional heir. What made the moment so unsettling was not simply the content of the declaration, but the realization that it carried legal and emotional force no one could challenge. Diana had ensured that her intentions would not be interpreted, they would be obeyed. And suddenly, those who had spent decades preserving royal balance found themselves confronting a disruption they could neither control nor ignore. Behind closed doors, conversations began immediately. Senior advisors, individuals who rarely allowed emotion to interfere with protocol, spoke in low, careful tones, aware that every word now carried consequence. They understood that Diana's decision had not merely elevated Catherine privately, it had elevated her symbolically. She had been given guardianship over something that transcended property or sentiment. She had been entrusted with Diana's emotional authority, a form of influence that existed outside official titles, but carried equal, if not greater, power. Some advisors reacted with quiet concern, not because they doubted Catherine herself, but because they feared what her designation represented. It altered perception. It shifted gravity. It placed Catherine at the emotional center of Diana's legacy, a position no royal spouse had ever occupied before. That kind of influence could not be easily measured, but its presence would be felt in every decision, every public moment, every internal dynamic moving forward. Others, however, saw it differently. To them, Diana's declaration was not a disruption, it was a correction. They believed Diana had exercised her final right as both mother and princess, choosing someone she trusted to preserve the emotional truth the monarchy had often struggled to maintain. They viewed her decision as sacred, not because it was convenient, but because it was intentional. And that made it untouchable. Emotional tensions surfaced in subtle but undeniable ways. Silence lingered longer in conversations. Questions were asked carefully, indirectly, as if no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge how profoundly the ground had shifted beneath them. The palace had always relied on structure, predictability, continuity, but Diana's decision introduced something far more unpredictable: emotional legitimacy, and that was something no institution could regulate. At the center of it all was Catherine herself. She had not asked for this, she had not expected it. The weight of Diana's trust was not something she could prepare for. It arrived without warning, without transition, placing her at the intersection of legacy and expectation. Those closest to her understood the enormity of what she had inherited, not in material terms, but in emotional responsibility. She was no longer simply part of the monarchy. She had become part of Diana's unfinished story, and the palace, for all its strength and tradition, struggled to contain the implications, because this was not a decision that could be quietly absorbed into routine. It was a decision that demanded recognition, it demanded acceptance, it demanded change. And as officials wrestled with the political meaning of Diana's final act, they understood one undeniable truth. The emotional balance of the monarchy had shifted forever, because while the palace wrestled with the political consequences, William faced something far more personal: the realization that his mother had prepared Catherine for a role even he had never fully understood. For William, this wasn't about inheritance. It was about trust, about understanding why his mother had chosen Catherine, not him, to safeguard her legacy. And as he reflected on Diana's words, William began to see something he had never fully recognized before. His mother hadn't replaced him. She had protected him by choosing someone she knew would never let him face the crown alone. That realization did not arrive instantly. It unfolded slowly, painfully, forcing William to confront emotions he had spent years quietly containing. For so long, he had carried the invisible weight of expectation, the understanding that one day he would stand at the center of an institution that demanded strength above all else. He had accepted that responsibility without hesitation, but now, for the first time, he understood that Diana had seen something deeper. She had seen the cost. She had seen the loneliness that came with being the one everyone depended on, but few truly understood. And she had refused to let him endure that isolation without protection. At first, the declaration had felt like distance, like a quiet shift that he hadn't anticipated. He had always believed that Diana's legacy would flow directly to him, not out of entitlement, but out of connection. He was her son, her closest bond, her living continuation. But her choice forced him to see beyond that assumption. It forced him to recognize that inheritance was never her true concern. Preservation was. Diana hadn't doubted him. She had doubted the system around him. She knew that the crown could elevate him while simultaneously isolating him, shaping him into something the world needed, while quietly eroding the parts of him that made him human. Catherine, in Diana's eyes, was the safeguard against that erosion. And as William Ra affected on Catherine not as the future queen, but as the person who had stood beside him through uncertainty, pressure, and scrutiny, he began to understand the depth of Diana's foresight. Catherine had never tried to reshape him. She had never tried to compete with the crown's demands. She had simply remained steady, present, unshaken. Diana had recognized that strength underscore attachment, even before William himself fully appreciated it. That realization didn't weaken him. It strengthened him. It reframed Catherine's role not as someone who shared his burden, but as someone who anchored him through it. His trust in her deepened, not because of Diana's declaration alone, but because Diana had articulated something William had felt but never fully defined. She had given words to a truth he had lived, and in doing so, she had removed the quiet fear that he might one day stand alone against the machinery of the crown. Diana had ensured that he never would. He began to see her decision not as an act of separation, but as an act of unity. She had bound his future to someone she trusted to preserve not just his legacy, but his humanity. And in that moment, William no longer saw the vault as a revelation of the past. He saw it as a bridge to the future, a final act of protection from a mother who understood that true strength did not come from standing alone, but from standing beside someone who would never let you fall. And in that acceptance, a new reality began to emerge, one where Diana's final decision would permanently reshape the monarchy's emotional future. Diana had done what no royal had ever done before. From beyond silence, beyond time itself, she had shaped the crown's emotional destiny. She had chosen her successor not by blood, but by trust. And in doing so, she ensured that her legacy would live not in tradition, but in protection, empathy, and strength. The vault had been opened, the truth had been revealed, and nothing inside the palace would ever be the same again. What Diana created was not simply a legal decision. It was a living continuation of her voice, preserved with such precision that even decades later, it carried authority strong enough to redirect the emotional course of the monarchy itself. She had anticipated doubt, she had anticipated resistance, and still, she had moved forward with unwavering certainty, because she understood that legacy was not defined by titles or ceremonies. It was defined by who carried your truth forward when you no longer could. Catherine, standing at the center of that truth, had not sought this responsibility, yet Diana had seen in her something unmistakable, a quiet resilience, a strength that did not demand recognition, but earned it through presence alone. Diana had entrusted her not with power, but with preservation. She had placed her emotional legacy into Catherine's care, knowing that empathy, not authority, would be the force that ultimately protected William's future. And in doing so, she ensured that her influence would not fade into memory. It would remain active, shaping decisions, guiding perspectives, and protecting the humanity of the man destined to become king. For William, the revelation brought something he had carried without realizing its weight: clarity. The questions that had lingered for years, the quiet uncertainty about what Diana would have wanted for him, finally found their answer. She had never wanted him to stand alone. She had never wanted him to carry the crown without emotional protection. Her final act had not been about redefining hierarchy. It had been about preserving her son. And now, with that understanding fully realized, William no longer saw the vault as a symbol of loss. He saw it as a promise fulfilled. The monarchy itself now faced a transformate ion it could not reverse. Diana's voice, once confined to memory, had re-entered its foundation with undeniable force. Her decision had introduced something the institution could never manufacture on its own: emotional continuity. A bridge between past suffering and future strength. Catherine's emergence as the emotional heir was not a disruption. It was a correction, a restoration of something the crown had once lost and now, through Diana's foresight, had regained. Her final act did not challenge the monarchy's existence. It strengthened its survival. Because Diana understood something no one else had fully grasped. The crown's greatest vulnerability was not political. It was emotional, and by choosing Catherine, she had ensured that vulnerability would never again go unprotected. Her legacy was no longer confined to memory, nor to history. It lived forward, carried by those she trusted most, and as William stepped away from the vault, no longer burdened by uncertainty, but strengthened by understanding, one truth became undeniable. Diana had not left the future to chance. She had secured it with intention, with love, and with unwavering clarity. Because in the end, Diana didn't just leave behind a legacy, she left behind a guardian. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.